Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's tutorial, we're going to paint some loose watercolor anemone flowers. I feel like Finding Nemo every time I try to say anemone, so fair warning, I may or may not pronounce it incorrectly a few times in this video. But these are very beginner friendly, they're a lot of fun to paint, and I'm going to show you 3 different ways that you can paint them. So let's jump right in. As always, all of the supplies I'm using in this video are linked down below in the description box, so be sure to check that out if you're not sure what to use. And I'm going to paint 3 versions of the anemone. We'll start with the very basic flower, we'll then paint a layered version that's very similar, and then we'll paint a stemmed anemone in a side view perspective. So let's get started with the first way. This is the more basic way, just to get a little introduction into anemone flowers. And I'm going to actually start with the center of the flower. And I've loaded up some carbon black, and I'm just going to paint a simple little circle for the very center of this flower. And I'm going to leave a little sliver of white space for the highlight on one side. So that's going to be just the very center, and now we're going to leave some space and start adding the outer petals. So whatever color you're going to use for your petals, go ahead and mix up a decent amount of pigment and water in your brush. And I've switched to a size 8 round brush. It's a little bit bigger. And I'm going to leave some white space and then just drop some dots down in a little ring around the center. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can kind of make some of them a little more thick, some a little more dainty, but just make sure you have a decent amount of pigment on there. And now I'm going to rinse off my brush. So I just have clean bristles here, and similar to if you've watched any of my other floral tutorials, this is a very similar technique of adding the pigment and then using clean water to pull out some color. That's what we're going to be doing to create these anemone petals. So I'm using the tip of my brush and just pressing down to create a pretty basic petal shape, just like that. So I'll rinse off my brush and do the same thing right next to it. These are very rounded flower petals, so you can see I'm bringing my brush around at the top to round it out. Some of my other flower tutorials, we push down and lift back up to get a pointy edge petal, but we are going for the rounded petals here. So I'm just kind of working my way around here, creating these little petals. You can have a little bit of white space in between, but for the most part, you're just pulling color from that center. And if you find that the center dots have dried up while you're doing this and there's not enough pigment to be able to pull from, then you can just go ahead and re-wet it. So in that case here, I'm just re-wetting that color and then just rinsing off my brush. But now I have plenty of pigment to pull from. And I'll just continue making these little curved petals all the way around. So those are going to be the basic petals for the anemones, and you can always add some little wispy marks in between if you want to make it look a little bit more loose and wild. And then the other thing I like to do is go back in to the very center, and because these petals are still wet, when I drop back in some more color, you can see it just gently bleed out into the petals, which is a really beautiful effect. And I don't want this ring to be too dark because in the next few steps, we're going to add the little black dots of the stamen and connect them. So I want those black dots to be able to stand out. So don't worry about making this too dark. And then since these are still wet, you can always go back in and add some more color in around the edges of the petals. There's no right way to do this. I'm just painting in the loose style, which means you can drop in color when you want. You can just embrace the bleeds and the blooms that happen and just make it your own. And now I'm going to go ahead and let this dry completely, and then we'll go back in and add the finishing touches. Again, this is the very basic one, so we'll be doing a layered one after this, but this just kind of gives you a better idea of the structure of the flower. So I've given this plenty of time to dry, and now we can add the final touches. I've gone back down to my size 4 round brush. Again, all these supplies are linked below if you're curious what I'm using. And I'm going to dip back into my black. And what I'm going to be doing, I brought you in a little closer so you can see this better, is I'm going to start adding a variety of little dots in a ring around the center. I'm just barely tapping my brush here. Some of them are a bit thinner, some of them are a bit thicker, and I'm leaving a little bit of space. I don't just want big, huge globs all the way around. I want a little bit of space in between there. And I'm just going to work my way around using the very tip of my brush to create these little dots. And we'll be connecting these in the next step for rounding out the stamen. And when I add these, I typically like to have a little bit thicker of dots closer to the very center. You can see that I'm doing that now. And then some really dainty dots on the outer edge, just to give it a good variety. And also make sure that you're not doing a completely uniform circle. So if you see any areas that look like all the dots are lined up too perfectly, just go in and smudge a few spots so that you can keep that organic variability, because you want it to look natural. So that's looking pretty good for the center, and now I'm going to use that same brush, but I'm just going to use the very tip because I want to get fine tip lines. And I'll just start making these little tiny lines connecting the very center dot that we created at the beginning of the painting with the dots that we just added. And same thing with the lines here. You want some of them to be a little bit thinner, some to be a bit thicker. Add some at the top with the kind of outer dots that you made. And keep your white space in mind here too, because you don't want to fill this entire gap with black. You want to be able to differentiate all of these lines. And I'll just continue working my way around the circle. I'm not worried about connecting each and every single little dot. I'm more so just indicating that they're all connected, but not necessarily drawing an individual line to each and every dot. And there we go. So that is our very first anemone flower. And now we're going to do a very similar process, so we'll get a lot of good practice in with this flower, but we're going to move on to a layered flower. So it'll look very similar, but just have an added layer of depth. So for this next one, we're gonna start it the exact same way. So I have my carbon black loaded in my brush, and I'm going to paint my little circle for the very center of the flower and leaving a bit of a highlight. And once I'm done with that, I'm going to go ahead and do the same exact thing we did last time, where I'm getting a lot of that same color pigment and water. I'm going to leave some white space and start adding these dots around the center. And remember, this is where we're going to be pulling all the color from when we paint the petals, so you just want to make sure you have plenty of pigment and plenty of water in your brush when you add these little dots. And I'm back to my size 8 brush, and this Neptune brush really holds a lot of water, which is great. And this is where the difference is going to be from the first one. So we're going to be doing 2 layers, the first layer lighter and the second layer a bit darker. So as you add your petals, you're going to add a little bit of white space. So I'll start by adding the first petal the same way, keeping it nice and light, but I'm going to leave a little bit of white space in between. So in this first flower, we did petal, petal, petal right next to each other, but now I want to leave a little white gap in between the 2 petals. And that's where I'm going to add an overlapping petal when we get to the second layer. But for now, I'm just going to work my way around, leaving a bit of white space in between. Again, we're painting in the very loose style, so don't worry about having every single petal look perfect. You can add some little stray brush strokes. You can see the outer edge of this petal is a little bit wonky, but that is all part of loose style painting. So just go ahead and work your way around, keeping this first layer nice and light because we want to have room to go darker for the second layer. If you go too dark on this first layer, you're not really going to have enough room to go darker. And this is one of those flowers, it's another one of these trust the process type of projects because obviously at this stage it looks really wonky and weird, but once we go back in and we add a second overlapping layer, it's really going to look beautiful. So let's go ahead and give this time to dry completely because as we add our second layer, we don't want it all to just bleed and blend together. So now that it's dry, we can go ahead and add the second layer. And I want it to be slightly darker than this first layer, but not drastically darker. And we're just going to add these same type of petals right over the top. So you can see this color, the second layer, is just slightly darker. I'm even going to add a little more pigment here. And I'm just kind of loosely adding these petals right over the top. And you can start to see that transparency and that layered effect building. And so I'm going to do that same thing right next to it, adding some color, letting my brush expand out onto the page to create these petals, and working my way around. And like I said with the first one, you can add some little wispy marks in between them, make it a little more loose and organic looking, add some character to the petals. It does not have to be perfect. That is the best part of loose watercolor painting, is it does not have to be perfect and you don't need to make super precise brush strokes. You can just be loose and keep it carefree and expressive. But you can start to see this beautiful layered effect where those light petals are peeking out between them, and then these petals on top just have a nice overlay. So I'm just adding a little more character here, rounding out some of these petals, and just kind of softening the edges of some of these, because again, I want it to look very loose and wispy and not too rigid. And this one's also a little bit more on the blue side. So I've been using Quinacridone Lake and Ultramarine Deep, and the second one has a little bit more of the ultramarine. So I'm going to go back in and add a little bit more of that Quin Lake and just tap some of that in on these petals. And you can see that bleeding and blending of the two colors. And it just adds another interesting element to the piece. And it all also adds to that loose effect because you can't exactly control how those color bleeds are going to happen when you add stuff like that, which is just one of my favorite parts. And then last step again, just going back in and tapping in a little more color on that inner edge. And now we're going to do the same steps of adding in the little stamen dots and the lines, but again, we need to give this time to dry. So now the second layer is dry, and I'm going to go back to my carbon black, and I'll do the same thing we did for the other one. So I have a good amount of black loaded up in my brush, and I'm just going to start adding in some little dots, making a ring on the inner part of this flower. And same way that we did before, we're going to be using that same black and using the very tip of your brush, or you can move to a smaller round brush. It's up to you and what you have available. And just start creating those connecting lines using the very tip and also varying the pressures. So some of them are a bit thinner, some are a bit thicker. And remember, you're not worried about connecting each and every little dot, but more so just indicating some lines to show that yes, they are connected, but you don't need to see every part. And in my opinion, this is really what brings the whole anemone together. Without that center, this would just kind of look like a basic loose watercolor flower. But those dots and lines in the stamen, those are really the key elements of an anemone. So there you go. It's a little bit different, but you add that second layer just to add a little bit of depth. So now that we have those two under our belt, I wanted to do one more in a different perspective. The first two are both the straight-on bird's eye view, but now we're going to do a little bit of a side view, which can be a little harder, but it doesn't have to be too crazy. So in this case, I'm actually going to switch up our process. I'm not going to start with the very center. I'm just going to start by penciling in a little half circle shape, just so I know where the center is. You don't have to pencil that in for sure, but it just helps keep me on track. And we are going to start with the petals this time. And when you're doing different perspectives, it's really just about the size and direction of the petals. So these ones up at the top are going to be longer. They'll be a little shorter on the side, and then we'll have a petal in front. And again, we're doing this in loose style, so it does not have to be too perfect. But learning how to do at least a little bit of a different perspective can really help you build out interesting compositions. And that way, not all of your flowers have to be that straight-on view. And I'll start by just adding, just like we did in the other ones, some of that pigment, and I'm just going to outline that half circle. So I'm not doing a full circle like we did last time. I'm just starting with that. And I'll start with the very middle because that's going to be the longest petal. And doing the same process, just pushing my brush down and pulling some of that color up. And this is going to be the longest petal, or the tallest one, I should say, of all of them. So keep that in mind as you add the next petals. So this one will be a little bit shorter on the left side, kind of curving up a bit. And same thing on the other side. And those are our first three petals, and now I'm going to add a couple little ones coming off on either side. And it's just going to be kind of pointing horizontally, and just a little tiny petal that you're pulling in towards the center. And same thing on the other side. And now I'm going to add this bottom petal. And so I'm going to load up a light value of the same color, and I'm going to do almost kind of like a sideways leaf shape. So you can see how I'm going to do it first, starting light, applying some pressure down, and making the top of this petal kind of curving upward, and then pulling back down. So it's kind of like a sideways leaf shape. And this is the petal that's kind of going to be, it's hard to explain at this point, but it's kind of overlapping the center of the flower. So in order to convey that, we want to add a little bit more color, so it can be a shadow down at the bottom, because that's where the base of this petal is curling upwards. Keep in mind, this is loose style. It does not have to be perfectly accurate, but even just adding a little color at the bottom can help convey that sense of curling on the petal. And one more time, I'm just going to go back in with a little bit of a darker pigment and just tap it in. And just like the other ones, it'll really start to come together once we add the stamen. And this is also why I like using a mixture of two different colors to create this kind of blue-purple color, because then in different areas you can tap in different colors. So you can see I'm using more of the Quinn Lake here, and then more of the blue up at the top. It just adds a nice kind of variety. And these petals are still a little bit wet, so while it's still wet, you can add some more brush strokes and a bit of texture to the petals. And feel free to do this however you'd like. You can tap in more color, you can add some lines, and then give it time to dry before we go back in to add the stamen. And now we can go ahead and add in that center once it's dry. Like I said, we're not doing perfectly anatomically correct, very detailed, realistic flowers here, but even being able to add just a little bit of a different perspective in the loose style can really help add some dynamic interest to your floral pieces so that not every flower is straight on. So I'm just wanting to show a little bit of that center kind of peeking out behind that petal. I'm not doing the full circle like we did on the other ones because this front petal is covering that. But you can kind of imagine if it had a full circle, if that front petal was not in the way. And once you add that, then we'll do the same step that we have been doing, which is adding in those little black dots. And I'm just kind of following the line of where those petals are starting. So go ahead and add those. I actually got a little carried away on this part and added probably too many, but that's okay. Painting in different perspectives has really always been a struggle for me for a long time. So if you find this challenging, give yourself some grace, especially if you've never painted a different perspective before. I still struggle with it, as you can see on this one. It's not perfect, but it's okay. And then we'll go ahead and add in the dainty little lines, just like we've done on the other two flowers. And there we have it. So we have a couple different perspectives. We have a few different techniques. We have the single layer, double layer, and then a bit of a side view. And I'll also show you how we can add some leaves. And the leaves on anemone flowers are a little bit weird. They're not your typical, it's not at least how I typically paint loose flowers that are kind of almond shaped. But they kind of have like a spiky, stringy look to them at the very base of the flower and then the stem. So let's give it a whirl. So I loaded up some green into my brush and I'm gonna start, again, loose style, don't worry too much about making it look perfect, but I'm gonna start by just gently adding in a little bit of where the stem is gonna be connecting to the base of this flower. And then I'll go ahead and paint just a very simple stem coming down. And it'll be a little bit thicker at the top. And that's just a basic stem, nothing too crazy. But then what the interesting part of these is, it's not my favorite type of leaf, honestly, but that is what they truly look like. So they have almost kind of like coral looking stringy leaves, like I said, coming out of the base. So let's just take a stab at it. I'm not worrying too much about each brush stroke. I'm just creating these little wispy marks like that because that is truly what the leaves of these anemone flowers look like. And as you add these, you also want to make sure you're varying the value. So some of these I'll do a bit lighter, and then I'll go back once these dry and add a second layer that is a bit darker. But for now, I'm just kind of adding in this first layer of little weird wispy leaves. I don't want to hate too much on them, but it's just not a type of leaf that I'm used to painting. And it's not as soft and romantic looking as some of the leaves that I typically paint. It's a little more prickly looking. But it's always good to practice new styles, so I'm just going to add a couple more in there. And you know I usually like to have a lot of movement in my leaves, so this leaf right here on the left is a little bit too straight for my liking, so I'll just add a bit of a curve to that to give it at least a little bit of movement and shape. So it's not just sticking out super rigid and straight. So I'm going to let this dry and then I'm going to do one darker layer. You can see the stem is a bit of a darker green, so I want to match that with these darker leaves. So once it's dry, I'll just do a very similar second layer on top to add a bit of depth. I don't want to cover up every single stroke that I did in the first layer, but I'm just kind of adding a bit more to it. Some of it's overlapping, some of it is new, and you can see the second layer better matches the stem, so it just looks a little more cohesive. And of course you can also add some of these leaves on the straight up flowers that we did first. And also you're more than welcome to do any style of leaf that you'd like. For loose style painting like this, it does not have to be perfectly accurate leaves. So if you don't like this style of leaf, that's perfectly fine, and you can add any type of greenery that you'd like. Just make it your own. So I'm just creating a bit of a curve here. Just kind of varying my stroke. Some of them are a bit thinner, some of them are thicker. And just adding these little spiky leaves. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed painting these anemones, and be sure to check out some of my other floral tutorials to keep practicing more types of flowers and compositions. Don't forget to like this video if you found it helpful, and I will see you next time.